All right, let's dive right in. Today, we're talking about an organism that absolutely demands our full attention in the lab, Streptococcus gallolyticus. What might have once been dismissed as background noise is now recognized as a critical clinical signal. Everything we're going to cover is pulled from a really comprehensive Gemini Deep Search review, so you're getting the latest insights that you can take straight back to the bench. Let's get into it.
Wow, this quote really just says it all, doesn't it? It gets right to the heart of why this matters. When we identify Streptococcus gallolyticus down to the subspecies, we're doing so much more than just putting a name on a bug. We are literally providing predictive clinical intelligence. Our lab report becomes a direct consultation, and it can completely change the entire course of a patient's care.
So, what's the big secret here? Well, it's the fact that Streptococcus gallolyticus is more than just a pathogen, it's a sentinel. It's a warning sign. Finding this organism in a blood culture is like seeing a biological flare go up, alerting us to a hidden and frankly often more dangerous problem lurking underneath, colorectal cancer. Understanding this link is absolutely vital for our practice.
Let that number sink in for a second. 7.26. That is the pooled odds ratio. So what does that actually mean? It means a patient with bacteremia from Streptococcus galloticus subspecies galloticus is over 7 times more likely to have a colorectal neoplasm compared to patients with bacteremia from other bugs in the old Streptococcus bovis group. That is a massive clinical signal coming directly from our lab.
So, how did we get here? How did we figure out that one little subspecies could be such a huge warning sign? Well, the answer is buried in the taxonomy. For decades, Streptococcus bovis was just this confusing umbrella term. It wasn't until we shifted to molecular classification that we finally unlocked the true clinical significance of these organisms.
You can really see the evolution right here on this timeline. It's a journey from total confusion to real clarity. Back in the 50s, it was just Group D strep. By the 70s, we got a little better, separating them into biotypes based on mannitol fermentation. But the real game changer, the revolution, came in the 2000s with molecular methods like 16S rRNA and SOD-A gene sequencing. That's what finally gave us the distinct, clinically meaningful subspecies we work with today.
Okay, this table right here, this is basically the Rosetta Stone for this entire topic. This is the crucial translation you need to know. What we used to just call biotype I is now Streptococcus gallolyticus subspecies gallolyticus. That's our big sentinel for endocarditis and colorectal cancer. Then you have biotype 2/2, which became subspecies pastorianus, and suddenly we're talking about a completely different clinical picture, neonatal sepsis. And biotype 2/1, that's now Streptococcus infantarius. Getting this translation right is, well, it's everything. All right, so we know the what and the why. Now let's get practical and talk about the how. What does the actual identification pathway look like for us at the bench from the second a blood culture bottle flags positive all the way to our final report? The workflow is going to feel pretty familiar. It all starts with the basics, right? Gram stain. Gram-positive cocci, usually in pairs or short chains. On the blood agar plate, we're looking for those small gray colonies, and they're typically non-hemolytic or maybe alpha-hemolytic. From there, we move to our key biochemicals to quickly rule out the most common thing we might confuse it with, which is Enterococcus. But that final step, that's the critical one, getting that definitive subspecies-level identification.
Now here's where we hit a critical decision point. See, both Streptococcus gallolyticus and Enterococcus are bile esculin positive, and that can definitely trip you up. But there are 2 tests that give us that clear separation. Streptococcus gallolyticus will not grow in 6.5% salt broth, and it's PYR negative. Enterococcus, on the other hand, is positive for both. It just goes to show you, these classic old-school tests are still incredibly powerful for the initial workup.
When it comes to the definitive ID, we've got our 2 main players, right? MALDI-TOF and sequencing. MALDI is our workhorse. It's fast. It gives us a species-level ID in minutes. But, and this is a huge but, its ability to nail down the subspecies depends entirely on the quality of its spectral database. If your library isn't expanded, the risk of misidentification is very real. That's why for the unambiguous gold standard answer, especially when the stakes involve a potential cancer diagnosis, sequencing housekeeping genes like SODA is still the way to go.
So once we have that idea, our work directly informs what the clinicians are thinking. So let's broaden out a bit and look at the full spectrum of diseases that are tied to these different subspecies we've just learned how to identify.
Of course, infective endocarditis is the classic, right? It's a textbook presentation, especially in older patients. But the real headliner, the one we've been building up to, is that colorectal cancer link. Study after study shows that over 60% of patients with subspecies gallolyticus bacteremia are found to have underlying tumors. But then, you switch over to subspecies pastorianus, and the story changes completely. Now we're talking about neonatal sepsis and meningitis, a really dangerous mimic of group B strep. Okay, so we've nailed the ID. We know the risks. The next call we're going to get from the clinical team is how do we treat this thing? So let's jump into the current guidelines and the breakpoints that actually inform our susceptibility reports. First up, let's look at the Dutch swab guidelines, and you'll see a really clear trend here. For the highly susceptible isolates, we're talking a penicillin MIC of 0.125 or less. The big takeaway is the move away from routine gentamicin. For native valve endocarditis, it's 4 weeks of penicillin G or ceftriaxone by itself. For prosthetic valves, you just extend it to a 6-week course. This isn't a random change, it's a very deliberate effort to avoid the risk of aminoglycoside toxicity.
And this isn't just a local thing. This trend is global. The major international guidelines from the ESC and the AHA are saying the exact same thing. For these super susceptible strains, monotherapy with Pen-G or ceftriaxone is the standard of care. 4 weeks for native valves, 6 for prosthetic. Aminoglycosides are being kept in reserve, which minimizes the risk for the very patients, often elderly, who are most likely to get this infection in the first place.
Now, what about our smallest patients? For kids and neonates, the approach gets tailored to the syndrome. For neonatal sepsis, which is often caused by that subspecies pastorianus, a 10 to 14-day course of ampicillin or penicillin is pretty standard. But if that infection crosses the blood-brain barrier and causes meningitis, you have to extend that duration to 14 to 21 days to make absolutely sure you've eradicated it from the central nervous system.
And of course, all of this is guided by our breakpoints. The EUCAST breakpoints are what we live by. For benzyl penicillin, an MIC of 0.25 or less is susceptible. Over 2 is resistant. But I want to point out that zone in the middle, the I category. Susceptible, increased exposure. This is so important. That's not us being wishy-washy. It's a direct clinical instruction to use a high dose or an optimized dosing regimen. Our report is literally shaping the treatment plan.
Okay, let's bring this all home. Let's connect all these pieces back to the most important point, the very real-world impact of the work we do every single day in the lab.
Let's clear something up about infection prevention, because this is a point of confusion for a lot of people. Just contrast Streptococcus gallolyticus with something like Streptococcus pyogenes. Group A strep is an external threat, right? It's spread by droplets, so it requires transmission-based precautions. Streptococcus gallolyticus is the complete opposite. It's an endogenous bug. It comes from the patient's own gut. Transmission happens when it translocates across a leaky or compromised gut barrier. That's why we just use standard precautions. The best prevention isn't putting the patient in isolation, it's finding and fixing that underlying GI problem.
You know, this all leads to a concept that I think is just so incredibly powerful for what we do. I call it prognostic identification. This is precisely what we are doing when we report Streptococcus gallolyticus subspecies gallolyticus. Our result isn't just a name on a piece of paper, it's a prognosis. It is a critical clinical directive that is symbiotic right there in the organism's name. So this all brings me to a question I want you to take back to your lab. And I'm serious, go look at your reports tomorrow. Is your language clear enough? When you report Streptococcus gallolyticus, subspecies gallolyticus, does it include a canned comment that highlights the strong association with colorectal neoplasia and recommends clinical correlation? Are you making sure that critical signal is being transmitted loud and clear, or is there a chance it could be getting missed?
Because really, when you strip everything else away, this is what it's all about. Your precise, careful work at the bench is the first essential step. You are the one triggering a diagnostic cascade that can lead to the early detection of a malignancy. Your report, your work, has the power to save a patient's life. Never forget that.
And that's our deep dive on Streptococcus gallolyticus, the true sentinel bacterium. For a full list of all the sources we use from our Gemini Deep Search, make sure you check out the accompanying notebook document. If you found this useful, please hit that subscribe button for more explainers like this. And we'd really love to hear about your own lab's experiences. So share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for joining us.